Hey guys, Clockwork here. I'll be talking about Halo Infinite and why it's a game I almost enjoy playing. Keeping to 343's publishing theme, this is the second half to a two-part review where I will be delving into Infinite's campaign. If you want to hear my thoughts about the multiplayer, watch the first part of this review. Now, for people who haven't played the campaign yet, this is your spoiler alert because this is a campaign review. I'm going to be going over aspects of the story. For instance, that the Master Chief, who has defeated an alien AI, a parasitic hive mind, and a whole theocratic alien empire, now faces his most dangerous opponent yet. A senior citizen space gorilla with bronchitis. There's one fact that can't be overlooked. Since 343 got their hands on the franchise, they hadn't issued delivering a satisfying and compelling campaign. Now, to give Halo 4 some credit, while the Didact was a lukewarm antagonist at best and the Prometheans were a poorly implemented sci-fi trope, what they did to make Master Chief have more of a personality by exploring his motivation and his relationship with Cortana was well done. If they had kept that kind of dialogue and storytelling, Halo 5 might have stood a chance. Instead, we all know the abomination they gave us that was 343's attempt to emulate the dual story that Halo 2 properly delivered. So now Infinite is a redo attempt to jumpstart a new story arc for Halo. Forget about the AI storyline. It's done. It's over. Move on. But before we get into the meat of this, let's go over what ludonarrative dissonance is. Coined by Clint Hocking, a former creative director at LucasArts, ludonarrative dissonance is when there's a conflict between the game's narrative told through the story and the narrative told through gameplay. A good example is Uncharted. Nathan Drake is a likable rogue who is also a treasure hunter and just so happens to kill the population of a small country. There are instances in the campaign where he says he doesn't like killing. Now, when the distance is bad, it can create aesthetic distancing, which is essentially your immersion, which would be anything that pulls you back to reality and makes you question the fictional world you're presented. To jump back in, the goal for Infinite was to restart the franchise, and 343 said as much, that it was supposed to be their version of Combat Evolved. So to dissect the issues with Infinite's campaign, I'll be comparing it to the first Halo game. At the highest level, the main difference between Bungie's storytelling and 343's is that Bungie's literary conflict was person versus the unknown, which is also person versus the supernatural, while 343's main conflict is person versus person. In Combat Evolved, we had the Master Chief versus the Covenant, the Flood, the Sentinels. The only named antagonist in Combat Evolved is Guilty Spark, and when he does become the antagonist, we only hear from him once more during the Maw. For all of 343's games, there has been a main villain. Halo 4, it was the Didact. In 5, we had 3 of them in the form of Alok, the Warden, and Cortana. And in Infinite, we have Atriox. Oh, right, he's busy being dead. We actually have Ashram.
Do you know him?
No.
Now, this method could work, but 343 has a few problems to overcome. The first being that they inherited a character who not only saved the human race, but simultaneously destroyed a galactic theological empire and a deadly hive mind that resulted in saving the galaxy. For someone who has done all of that, it's hard to present him with a specific adversary that could pose a challenge. The second problem, though, is their own doing. Their only real attempt at exploring his character was in Halo 4, when they delved into his relationship with Cortana, which they dropped. They also tend to kill each of their antagonists at the end of their games or abandon them completely, so any investment in their conflict is thrown out the window. Now, you could argue that person versus person has been in Halo before in the form of the Arbiter story in Halo 2, but he was part of that system. He had personal investment in taking Tartarus down. I mean, I'd say that Arbiter's conflict was more person versus society, but that's a different video. In Halo CE, the story is told to us solely from the Master Chief's perspective, with Cortana basically being our guide through this fictional world. The Chief is just a vessel for us to experience the world. He has no real character. We don't know anything about the world beyond what we are presented. It's the classic phrase you learned in high school English: show, don't tell. Every element in CE is shown to us. We're shown the might of the Covenant from the get-go because we experience them taking over the Pillar of Autumn. We're shown how the Marines are struggling to regroup and counterattack because without the Chief, they end up dying. And when we're introduced to the Flood, we have a whole level that builds up to how insane and scary they are. I think we can all agree that 343 Guilty Spark and the library have left huge impacts for those of us who played them when we were kids. The pacing of the story allowed the player to digest what was happening. Each cutscene just set up the scene and the critical information we needed to continue on with the mission. Nothing challenged that we were a badass super soldier. Now, while Infinite has this burden of knowledge, it can't decide what it's keeping and what it's leaving behind. The start of the story is proof enough of this. In Combat Evolved, the situation is explained right at the beginning, even before we get to gameplay. We know we're on the run, that the Covenant are after us, and that somehow they ambush the Autumn. Then we get to experience the Autumn going down, how we escape. Infinite tells us the situation, that the ship is going down, that this new threat got the jump on us. The next scene we see is the Chief trying to defend the hangar, then out of nowhere, Atriox appears and beats the Chief down in 4 hits. Now mind you, this is a guy who has survived about 3 different instances of falling to a planet, but 4 hits from a space gorilla and we're toast. Okay, 343. We then meet some guy in a broken Pelican that he manages to keep together, then some amount of time passes and the Chief is saved by this guy, Echo 216. Who then directs us to look out the window. The Halo we saw in the beginning now has a hole in it, and there's wreckage throughout the area. The enemy then finds us, and we decide to board them. So what do we know by the time gameplay starts? We know that the ship is under attack by some kind of alien force. Just by the fact he's named, we know Atriox is a big deal. We also know he was willing to board an exploding ship just to beat the Chief down and let him go. We also know the UNSC lost, which we could have deduced prior to the pilot telling us, and that somehow the Halo ring got a big hole in it. In Combat Evolved, we learned what was going on and even had an epic prep scene all within roughly 3.5 minutes. In the 10-minute opening cutscene of Infinite, we have no idea what's going on. All we know for sure is a space orc named Atriox threw us into space. Now, if you're new to the franchise and this is your first Halo, you don't even know the Master Chief is called the Master Chief. And even if you're a fan of Halo, there's a chance you don't know who Atriox is, considering he was introduced in Halo Wars 2, which was one of the more unpopular titles.
Do you know him? No.
But then none of that matters because we're told a minute or so after the cutscene that Atriox is dead and some older sounding space orc with a breathing problem is now in charge. We are thrown into a situation we know the bare minimum about, and the pacing of the story works against itself to tell a cohesive vision. In fact, the narrative gap is so bad that between the moment Chief was thrown into space and when he was picked up, 6 months had gone by. I finished the game and didn't even know that. How is that not the first thing out of Echo 216's mouth? Eventually we're told that by the weapon, but if you weren't paying attention, like I was, then you'd be confused because throughout the game, we see smoking escape pods and other indicators that this conflict just happened. So even before we start, what the story is telling us is vastly different from what the gameplay is telling us. On top of that, to further create more aesthetic distancing, we aren't even presented the story as if we're experiencing it through the Chief. The first thing we see after the title scene is Escargot and a flunky arguing. Throughout the game, we as players are given information the Chief knows nothing about, and what's worse is it's revealed that throughout half the game, the Master Chief is hiding something from us. So he isn't a vessel for us anymore, he's a proper character who makes his own choices. Though he's not even a proper character because characters change during a story. 343 doesn't expand on what makes the Chief tick or what his motivations are. I mean, hell, 216 goes through far more character growth than the Chief does, and the time on screen is drastically disproportionate. Now, this is a subtle but massive change in dynamic between us, the audience, and how the story of the Master Chief has been told to us before. Prior to this, Master Chief was an insert character. He could look how we imagined him to be, and while 343 gave him more of a personality in Halo 4, they didn't take away that aspect of him. We still knew everything he knew. We experienced the story through his eyes. In Infinite, we're not experiencing the story through the character. We're along for the ride. We're more the audience of a movie rather than the main character of a game. So even structurally, the game works against us to become immersed. This is probably the greatest sin that 343 has committed story-wise. A big part of what made Halo work was the natural immersion that you were Master Chief. The story was about your struggle to save humanity, and the Chief and you were a team, and Cortana helped you. Another glaring issue is that the audio logs have a combination of crucial background information that should have been vocalized in the story and world-building fluff that is just nice to hear. The Prisoner, a series of audio logs depicting a conversation between the Harbinger and a UNSC prisoner, hint at some important story elements and reveals some motivation that would have been fantastic to show somewhere in the actual story. There are even audio logs that depict Infinity's approach, so if you want to know exactly what happened to the start of the story, well, you'll piece it together eventually. That's assuming that you find all 104 audio logs, as there's no real way to tell which ones help explain this story further. Audio logs are a useful storytelling element to include in games, but unless the story itself is told through these audio logs, they shouldn't have anything that could potentially change the facts of the journey as told through the events of the main story. Learning about characters' motivation, why events in the story are happening, crucial story elements, these kinds of things shouldn't be in audio logs unless they are clearly stated in the main story, and the audio logs are just there to expand on that. There's one instance where we learn about the reason why the Banished are here. Problem is, you can learn about that before the major reveal in the main story through one of Ed Sheeran's audio logs. On top of that, the tone of the game is completely different from that of Combat Evolved. Even though they lost their ship, that they were outnumbered and outgunned, and it seemed like all was lost, the survivors of the Pillar of Autumn never gave up. A people on the verge of extinction, and their grit continues even while facing the most impossible odds. The Chief was a symbol of hope, but the Marines put up one hell of a fight without him. The tone in Infinite takes on a far more somber note, and our new sidekick, Echo 216, is constantly complaining about our next steps. What happened to the tenacity? For the longest time, Master Chief was the only Spartan in the game. All of these Marines are old enough to remember the Covenant War. They've faced worse than this. Just imagine Sergeant Johnson telling the Chief that we need to run away. Now imagine Echo 419 complaining about every single landing we had to make. In Halo CE, sure, we kept the plot going, but these support characters became iconic for their gung-ho attitude. I don't know about you guys, but when Echo 419 went down, I felt bad. She had been with us throughout the entirety of the campaign, helping us get in and out of some serious jams. I mean, I even tried to save her back when I was a kid. I tried to play the mission over and over again, trying to find a way to keep her alive. Now, when 216 got captured, I was kind of relieved. By that point, he'd become less negative, but the damage had already been done. The only character in Infinite who slightly resembles the old gun-ho attitude is the Weapon, and everyone is constantly bursting her bubble. With Infinite, there's another issue that comes up. There's no real reason why any of this is happening. I mean, eventually we get half answers. Like, the Banished are here because Cortana blew up the Brute homeworld. The Endless are dangerous for a reason? Not even getting into the poor lore decisions that led up to this, all of this information is just told to us. Apparently the Banished want to kill the humans just because? Strictly from a narrative view, there's little motivation to be invested in the reasons why this is happening. We don't even get to hear the news from Atriox or Escharum to make this feel personal. In fact, the only other moment we hear the Brute homeworld has been destroyed was through the audio logs, and Chief already seemed like he knew. Escharum tells us our humanity, the fact that we care about one another, is what makes us weak. Then why are the Banished doing this? Why would Aatrox care about his homeworld if having attachments is a weakness? How do the Banished still remain whole after Aatrox is gone? If domination and their whole warrior vibe are how they determine a hierarchy, then because Aatrox is assumed dead, wouldn't they be at each other's throats vying for power? There's just too much of this story that happens for the sake of something happening, and when everything is told to us, it's hard to care. Everything important happens off screen. We don't even get to see the important things that this whole game is apparently building up to. We only have the Forerunner's word that the Endless are bad, and apparently half of them were space racists, so maybe not the best guys to, take warnings from. Unfortunately, the gameplay doesn't help the issue. While they've done a nice job with the open world, there's nothing to it. Enemy bases repopulate after they are defeated, and have no real impact on gameplay. 6 months after we were supposed to lose, and we're still seeing what appears to be groups of Marines still fighting fresh. There are some who it seems more plausible, like they're defending a holdout, but there are others who are just out in the middle of nowhere with a bunch of equipment around them. I mean, hell, you can't find a weapon or a vehicle? Don't worry, there's an app for that. Echo 216 seems to moonlight as an Uber Eats driver and delivers an endless amount of weapons and vehicles. 6 months after we lost. Okay. While the mechanics of the open world don't make sense, at least the set design is lovely and visually immersive. With that being said, the open world doesn't hold a candle to the variety that we saw in Combat Evolved. After a while, the terrain of Pacific Northwest meets metal loses its sense of awe as time goes on. Overall, adding the open world aspect is just used to pad game time, which is a missed opportunity. 343 could have implemented an interesting and dynamic system that could have rewarded gameplay. Taking over different types of bases could have given advantages, or at least explained all the equipment being ordered in. For instance, the first base we come across is essentially an auto workshop, and we find a tank that the Banished were going to salvage. So why isn't that a mechanic? Instead of having infinite scorpions, what should have been implemented was having a limit to them, and having bases like these make them over a period of time. A weapons depot? Well, that's how we're getting battle rifles. A territory is considered a stronghold for an enemy? Reward us by taking the places around it by giving us advantages during the fight. And all the Marines we save. Surely they don't just become forgotten and disappear into the ether, right? If only we had other games to give us inspiration on how to implement meaningful open world design where we could somehow get a sense that our numbers were growing and could assault enemy bases with them. It seems like it's never really gonna happen, huh? We're never gonna really figure it out. It's a shame. This is a mistake that studios make quite often. That an open world makes the game better somehow without putting anything in it. An open world should be a key part of the game, whether that's through narrative or actual game mechanics like gathering resources. If it isn't, then it's just wasting your time. Unfortunately, the open world just highlights the fact that 343 still hasn't achieved that Halo moment. Assault on the control room, the beach assault on Silent Cartographer, the run on the Maw. The score, atmosphere, the composition of enemies and allies make those missions iconic. With how many bases that get assaulted in the open world, one would think that 343 would accidentally achieve that feeling. And while they've never managed to achieve that Halo moment, at least the gunplay itself is fun. Master Chief definitely feels like a super soldier in this version, but that can't carry the whole game on its back. The composition of enemies and how they act don't feel threatening. For instance, Elites and Brutes now feel identical to fight. They both have shields, they are both bullet sponges. When they get to a certain health, they rage. Speaking of bullet sponges, the boss fights are just that. There's no real interesting mechanic that we haven't really seen before. I mean, we fought cloaked elites before. Having one that just takes more shots isn't fun. This all just adds up to the core issue of Infinite. And that core issue is this: that while the narrative of the story and the narrative of the gameplay seem to constantly be at odds with each other, they're also at odds with themselves. Instead of showing us an interesting and engaging story where we're immersed, we're told a story where our role is audience instead of participant, where we are told to care about what is happening, when we don't even have a clear goal. Now, the gameplay of Combat Evolved didn't have a lasting impact on the game, but by the nature of an open world, our effort should be changing things. And unlike Combat Evolved, the composition of enemies posed a challenge to us. But with Infinite, it feels like nothing changes, and nothing is that much of a threat to us. In a sense, Infinite is a great example of how nihilism can be an interactive experience. Combat Evolved was 10 hours of engaging gameplay and story, where each narrative aspect worked hand in hand to show a cohesive and immersive vision. Nothing challenged that we were the Master Chief. We were on a great journey of tenacious resolve against impossible odds together with Cortana, as a team. We had a full game from beginning to end. Halo Infinite was a chance to reset expectations, to give the IP new love. Their version of Combat Evolved, a game that helped refine and define the genre of first-person shooters as a whole. In the end, it barely comes together as a decent game. I mentioned before that the tone of Infinite was different than Combat Evolved, that the Marines were far more somber, that our sidekick was pessimistic, how everything we knew was dying. There are 3 major rules when you're writing a story. Avoid LY words, always show, don't tell, and never put yourself in the story. Ever since Halo 4, 343 hasn't been able to deliver a satisfying campaign. And after 10.5 hours, I'm convinced that hasn't changed, and I think they know it. Everything from how it was released to what ended up being delivered in the game lacked cohesion. From one game to another, overarching story plots are abandoned and their antagonists forgotten. This game was delivered in pieces, drip-feeding content that should have been released as a whole. The story, everything from pacing to delivery, was self-loathing and ruined possible immersive experiences. The added open-world mechanic and the gameplay that was introduced by it, while at best of times provided a beautiful view, was shallow and a missed opportunity which could be the theme for this whole game. The world could have been dynamic and engaging. Instead, what we got was a shallow waste of time that added nothing to the campaign. This was supposed to be their Combat Evolved? Come on, 343. You had one job. Thank you guys for listening to my rant. I want to hear your opinions. Post a comment down below. Let me know what you think. Do you agree? Do you disagree?